Hello everyone, I'm now back with the second episode where I'm going to talk about the qualifier stage for the 2021 Deck Championship. Now I had to include a qualifier stage rather than just guessing the 40 strongest decks because while I may have a lot of knowledge about 1v1 Smash Up, nobody knows this game well enough. There are just too many different possible combinations and too many combinations that are better or worse than the sum of their parts for anyone to pick a good field of the 40 possible strongest decks in the game without picking some lemons and missing some gems. As a matter of fact, the decks that came out of the qualifier stage outperformed the decks that I put in the field because their components, the two factions that made them up, were really good, and also outperformed a big chunk of decks that earned their way into the field by performing really well as decks earlier rather than just as factions. Now, I was starting this in, February of 2021, and Marvel was the hot new expansion that had just came out. I had no data on how well the Marvel decks performed for my faction rating lists, so I came up with a crazy, over-ambitious idea. I made a 118-deck single elimination bracket involving all 28 possible combinations, 8 times 7 divided by 2 since it's an 8-faction expansion, of 2 Marvel factions, and 1 Marvel faction paired with each of the 90 previous factions, including the 15 NT variants. And then I also did a smaller bracket of just the 28 double Marvel decks, and said I'm going to grant 1 qualifier spot to the winner of each bracket. As it so happens, I play 2 game matches when testing decks in 1v1 because first player advantage is a thing. So when I play 2 decks against each other, each of them gets to play first in 1 game, and often with decks that are moderately far apart in terms of quality level, you end up with 1 game that's pretty likely to just go to the stronger deck, and the other game where the weaker game is playing first. That's often a very interesting struggle. So a lot of the time it's the battle between a draw for a win or a draw versus a loss, rather than too many matchups having 3 results possible. They're always possible, but usually one of the 3 results is pretty unlikely. In any case, when I played through this 28-deck double Marvel bracket, the way I set it up, 2 different Marvel decks made it to the final with 4-2-0 wins apiece, and then drew each other with 1 game apiece. Instead of playing more games between these 2 decks, I just looked at this and said 9-1 is good enough, I'm qualifying them both. These 2 decks were Sinister, Avengers, and Shield Kree. And for each qualifying deck, I'm going to give a little short feature on how that deck made it into the field. Sinister Avengers survived their qualifier tournament by combining the Avengers' big bodies, and the fact that Avengers is just a really good 1v1 faction, with Sinister 6's breakpoint reduction, and this combination makes bigger burst in terms of total breakpoint damage done in 1 turn than the vast majority of decks can effectively defend against. It turned out that its first 4 opponents were consistently unable to defend against the level of burst it did, and that led to it starting 8-0. Shield Kree, meanwhile, also was winning the same way. This seemed to be a bit of a Marvel theme with some of the top Marvel decks. They won by having just too big a burst than you could effectively defend against by having low power in play. In some cases, Shield Kree can drop 20 power at once with huge daisy chains of extra minion and action plays. Minion power increases, but then the really nasty thing they can do is they also have solid card draw in both their factions. Plus, with the flexibility of generating power through either their minion or action plays, if they don't need a gigantic burst, if they only need like a 10 power burst or something, they can often figure out how to generate this burst and then play a mission debriefing if they manage to get themselves 1 action play to spare, and this lets them refill their hand on top of breaking and winning a base. That is a very powerful advantage because in 1v1 Smash Up, most decks when they stretch themselves to break a base from significant distance away from the breakpoint, usually have to spend a turn or two reloading after this, and fitting in a mission debriefing means that Shield Kree can go punch, and then on the very next turn, punch again. Most defending decks cannot deal with that kind of an attack. And these two decks, it so happened that Shield Kree would perform better in the big tournament, but there was no indication yet in the qualifier phase of whether Sinister Avengers or Shield Kree would turn out to be the better deck. So after this first short period of getting my first two qualifiers, then I had a very slow job of playing through this 118 deck Marvel bracket. There's individual match descriptions on all the different Reddit episodes. I think I'm going to link to every single one of them in the description of this video. But the main overarching themes I found: Avengers are really, really good in 1v1. Spider-Verse and Sinister Six tend to struggle with most random opponents because I'm giving them a wide variety of opponents, not all of whom fit with them. Those two factions paired with something random are going to have a hard time in a 1v1 game. But for these two factions, I did find some exceptions. Spider-Verse does well with a partner that has a very strong defense and ways to interact with opposing cards. Spider-Verse has two struggles, which is they struggle at breaking bases on their own if the opponent decides to not be terribly aggressive about it or set up for big bursts. And they also can't interact with opposing cards for the most part. Like, you can web up one minion, but that's one minion. Aliens were able to cover this, and Spider Aliens eventually finished second in the Marvel bracket. Aliens cover this because they both have Invader Solitaire to not have to play aggressively if they don't want to, and they also have lots of ways to get rid of enemy minions, which Spider-Verse can't do, and sort of stall until they get a setup where they've drawn enough Spider specials to counterpunch against opponents breaking a base, and they have a VP edge from Invader Solitaire, which against decks of like A-class and below is going to be pretty consistent enough to win the game. Sinister Six, in contrast, well, the main good combination for Sinister Six I found in 1v1 at least was the Avengers with their big 5-power bodies. I would assume that you will get also positive results pairing them with knights or princesses. Also, people have pointed out that Sinister Werewolves work, although I have not been able to duplicate other people's Sinister Werewolves results, I think partially because they telegraph what they're going to do a little bit, and I punish telegraphing. And I think Sinister Six would also do well with a very strong swarm partner. Something like Sinister Robots is going to perform better than Robots with some other faction that has an overall rating similar to Sinister Six. Avengers, meanwhile, they were winning to the point where I worried I wouldn't be able to avoid Avengers on Avengers mirror matches. As it so happened, I barely avoided them. Now, as this tournament went on, I also saw some patterns emerging through the different rounds. First up, the draw rate in matches went up as I went from the early rounds to Sweet 16 and Top 8, because other than one exception, the remaining decks felt more and more evenly matched. But the other pattern I saw was that early on, in the first 2 or 3 rounds, the decks dropped out that didn't have good synergy between their factions. Even if they were Avengers decks or decks that had some other strong faction, if they didn't have good synergy between their factions, they generally did not make it as far as Sweet 16 or Top 8. However, around the Sweet 16 and Top 8, the decks that dropped out tended to be the decks that had one not very good faction. At that point, all the decks had synergy. So if a deck has synergy, but they've also got some dead weight in there, those decks were consistently dropping out to the decks that had 2 good factions in the deck, plus some synergy. It was just 2 different generations of decks getting called. But the deck that eventually won this bracket, as a matter of fact, winning 13 games out of 14, only dropping a single game to the all-evil Master Stars, was Explorers T Avengers. And that deck had 3 reasons why it's really good. First, Explorers T are a good faction. meaning that they aren't going to be deadweight, and actually they were better than a lot of other top decks in the brackets. Good faction. Avengers are also a really good faction, so no deadweight there either, and the third reason is there's strong synergy between the two factions. Avengers have big 5-power bodies, which pair well with both movement cards and the Explorer's extra minion play tricks, because if you're moving 5 power rather than an average minion of 3 power, your movement card just does more. It's almost as good as moving 2 minions instead of 1 when you're moving a big minion. And in addition, Avengers have a lot of card draw and minion reshuffle mechanics to get away with having 6 minions, and that also supports the Explorers having a bit of an overload on extra minion plays, which they sometimes struggle to power. So between the Avengers' reshuffle abilities and the Explorers' tight-in that uses up a minion play, this deck was able to actually take advantage of Explorer extra minion plays to their full power, and usually the way their games would go. The game looks competitive against a strong opponent for the first couple bases, then strong opponent breaks a base, and promptly watches helplessly as the exploring Avengers play enough extra cards to solo the new base that just came into play. Board control decks especially just sort of break apart when hit this way, because after the Explorers land that base solo, sometimes you get situations where maybe the Explorers also figured out how to get an extra base in play, and you've got something where there are now 2 undefended bases, and the board control deck is behind on victory points, and has to try to put their defense back together that just got shredded. They just usually just snowballs, and the Dragon's deck or whatever collapses. So Exploring Avengers came out of this qualifier looking extremely strong, and spoiler alert, they would do quite well in the overall championship. Now, for the final qualifier, I was originally going to have 4 slots for this, but since I let in 2 double Marvel decks, I only had 3 slots for the final qualifier. I paired some strong decks that I didn't quite feel deserved an immediate seed into the final 40, things like All-Stars plus Princesses, All-Stars plus Avengers. Like, All Princesses had proven to be a very strong deck in the past, mainly by abusing the combination of Ghostly Arrival and 5-power bodies, and also using the Princess's card draw abilities to draw the All-Stars combo cards a little more consistently. But they had also proven in a previous fairly high-level deck tournament that they seemed to fall off against the very best possible opposing decks. So there were some decks like this that I put into the qualifier, but I wanted them to have to make it through the qualifier in order to make it to the field of 40. I also asked other players for deck suggestions to see if I missed any important candidates, and looked at a bunch of cases with, okay, let's look at these new Marvel factions. Were there any cases where maybe the old faction would have rather played with a different Marvel faction than what it got to play with in the bracket? There was also one Ghost NT deck that made it to Sweet 16 without its Titan in the Marvel bracket, and obviously I put the Ghost T version of that into the qualifier. And yeah, I entered the final 4 decks from the Marvel bracket that didn't win the whole thing and gave them some buys. So after a lot of games, number of which were between some very strong decks, Spider Aliens, Cthulhu, Anansi, and Hydra Wizards made it through. In fact, sort of all 3 of these decks got to the qualifier by different routes as well. Spider Aliens came in with 3 buys because it finished second in the Marvel bracket. That's a lot of buys, but it earned them. Cthulhu Anansi was a deck that other people had suggested in the past, and it was actually pretty much untested by me. I think I'd played it in 4 games total. Hydra Wizards, meanwhile, was a deck that I looked at what good Hydra decks I'd seen in the Marvel bracket. They hadn't played with Wizards T, and I looked at this and I said, this might be really strong, so I paired the Hydras with the Wizards. So Spider Aliens made it into the championship because Aliens bonus VP allows them to play very defensively, and you know what? I talked about that in the Marvel bracket. They have a style which is able to cover Spider-Verse's weaknesses. I think one important point is that Spider-Verse usually in 1v1 needs to steal 2 bases with specials in order to win a game. It feels like that in most matchups. Spider-Aliens really only needs to steal 1, and when you're outside of 1 boss minion only getting 2 points of power per special, it's a little tricky to steal 2 bases with specials if your opponent knows that you really need to get more than 1 base with special, and your opponent's working to make you have to play several specials per base in order to steal them. So that ability to get away with stealing 1 base due to the extra VP is really a big deal. Cthulhu Anansi made it into the championship because when you're passing your Cthulhu Titan-generated madness to your opponent for gain with Anansi cards, not only do you have a madness spam attack that is actually a little bit faster than the typical Cthulhu T deck, but you also can generate aggro deck levels of power sometimes by taking advantage of Anansi cards that give you power tokens when you give away cards from your hand, or really nasty stuff like that. That combination is pretty broken, and Cthulhu Anansi ran over most of its opponents in the qualifier. Hydra Wizards made it kind of for the same reason as Shield Kree, although they don't necessarily have... Well, actually, they do have the same way to refill their hand and burst you at the same time. They might do it a little bit better. I'm not sure which deck is actually better still. Hydra's extra plays, however, make it easy to play the Wizard's Titan, who Wizards normally can get their Titan into play, but sometimes they have to gamble on neophytes, and you find yourself in a much worse position because you tried to play the Titan and didn't hit an action off your neophyte, and now you're wasting an extra turn trying to get your Titan out later. Hydra makes it easier because when you sacrifice a Hydra agent, that's just 2 free cards played out of the 5 you need per turn, and if one of them is a neophyte and hits something, it's pretty much a free Titan. Wizards also have 7 2-power minions with good comes into play effects to fuel Hydra's engine. I also tried Hydra with Innsmouth. It didn't quite do as well because Wizards have more active effects off of their minions. Innsmouth may be giving you better card draw off the minions and may give you more total power when they work on their high end of luck off playing multiple minions. But the Wizards have the capacity to do things with Neophyte, which helps make their daisy chains keep going. They can often hit that 20-plus power burst breakpoint, which means that there is no defense other than something that straight up reduces their minion power before they've played their minions. That is going to prevent them from breaking a base. And that turns out to be a nasty enough rush that if you're really dropping 20s on people, you might not need to interact with your opponent's cards at all in order to win games at a high level in 1v1. And that is all of the decks that made it through the qualifier. There were a lot of decks in this qualifier, but the ones that made it out, I think, were extremely strong, and all of them are decks that are capable of thumping most decks in a 1v1 game. In the next episode, I'm going to go over the group stage, where all of the decks, no matter how well or badly they were doing in the first couple rounds, played preset schedules of 3 opponents for 2 games each, so that we would get an initial set of records for me to start Swiss rounds. And I'll talk about that probably in only a few days from this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.